The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. That's the number to hold on to before anything else, because everything that follows only makes sense once you understand how little room there actually is out there. 2 shipping lanes, each roughly a mile across, with a 2-mile buffer running between them, and through that thin channel moves something like a fifth of the entire planet's oil and a massive share of its liquefied natural gas. So when a fleet of boats starts gathering inside that corridor, the world doesn't get days to react, it gets minutes. That's exactly what happened on a clear morning when a commercial satellite, the kind normally tasked with mapping farmland or tracking shipping containers, passed over the strait and captured something nobody expected. Roughly 130 Iranian fast attack boats sitting out in the open, arranged in 2 separate formations, right in the middle of one of the most watched stretches of water on Earth. No camouflage, no attempt to hide, just sitting there in daylight for anyone with the right imagery contract to notice. And notice they did. To really feel the weight of that image, you have to travel back 5 months to the event that set this entire journey in motion. On February the 28th, 2026, American and Israeli aircraft struck Iran in a coordinated wave that hit military installations, government infrastructure, and the country's top leadership in a single opening blow. Iran's supreme leader, the man who had led the Islamic Republic for years, was killed within the first hours of the war. According to President Trump, speaking to American media afterward, the strikes had also removed most of the likely successors his administration had been quietly tracking. Whoever Iran chose next wasn't going to be a familiar name, because the familiar names were already gone. Iran moved quickly to answer that vacuum. Within about a week, the assembly of clerics responsible for choosing a new supreme leader selected the fallen leader's own son. Analysts who follow the region read that decision as a message as much as a succession plan, a declaration that the system had no intention of softening, that removing a leader by force would only harden what came after him. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because it explains so much of what unfolds from here. A hardline government born in the same week it buried its own leader was never going to back down quietly. It was, in a sense, built specifically not to. From that new government's first days in power, the response was defiance. Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, broadcasting warnings over open maritime radio that passage would not be permitted. That closure carried no real weight under international law, but when a country is actively at war along that coastline, the difference between what's technically legal and what's actually safe collapses fast. Shipping companies understood the danger before any lawyer needed to explain it to them. Tankers turned around mid-route. Others simply anchored and waited it out. Oil and gas prices jumped almost overnight, and within weeks, hundreds of vessels, a large number of them flagged out of India, sat stranded at the edge of the strait, unwilling to bet their crews and cargo on whether Iran's threats were bluster or something real. Washington's answer was to widen the circle. The American president called on nations with a direct stake in that waterway: China, France, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, to send naval forces of their own to help secure passage, while promising continued strikes on Iranian targets along the coast. By early April, that request had hardened into an ultimatum: reopen the strait by a set deadline, or watch Iranian power plants and bridges become the next targets. Iran didn't blink. The deadline passed, the strikes continued. Then, on April the 8th, something gave. A ceasefire was reached, reportedly including an Iranian promise to fully reopen the strait to commercial shipping. For a short stretch, it looked like the pressure might finally be easing. It wasn't, not really. Within weeks, reports indicated Iran was once again controlling traffic through the strait on its own terms, rather than releasing it freely. And on April the 13th, the United States answered with a full naval blockade on Iranian ports. Within about a month, American forces had intercepted more than 80 vessels trying to move in or out of Iranian waters. And on April the 19th, Marines working alongside a Navy destroyer carried out the blockade's first direct seizure, boarding and taking control of an Iranian-flagged ship. That's the road that leads directly to the moment those 130 boats appeared on satellite imagery in early May. By then, the ceasefire from April was effectively dead in practice. The blockade was squeezing Iran's economy, and Iran, rather than standing its fleet down, pushed it back into the strait in serious numbers. Iran had also been laying naval mines as part of the same pressure campaign, and the American president responded by ordering the Navy to shoot and kill, in his own words, any vessel caught laying sea mines without hesitation. Specialized mine-hunting ships based out of Bahrain were tied directly into that mission. On May the 3rd, the United States announced it would begin actively escorting commercial shipping through the strait, an operation that became known as Project Freedom. It launched the following day. Central Command reported that Iran answered by firing cruise missiles and drones and sending swarms of small attack boats at commercial vessels, and in some cases directly at American Navy ships. The admiral overseeing the region said American forces intercepted the incoming missiles and drones, and that Apache and Seahawk helicopters sank 6 small Iranian boats in a single morning. Other tracking of that same operation put the total closer to 7 boats destroyed in those opening days, alongside a strike on a French-flagged commercial vessel. Now here's the part of the map most people never get to see, the part that explains why that morning went the way it did. Iran's swarm was never small boats against small boats. To understand what actually met those 130 vessels, you have to look at what was already sitting in the region days before the satellite even caught them. By late April, the United States had 3 full aircraft carrier strike groups operating simultaneously in the Middle East, a scale of presence not seen since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the largest carrier in the world, the USS Abraham Lincoln, and the USS George H.W. Bush, which had sailed all the way from Virginia, deliberately taking the longer route around the southern tip of Africa to avoid exposure near the Red Sea. Together, that deployment amounted to 12 escort ships, more than 200 aircraft, and over 15,000 sailors and Marines, all positioned in a single theater at the same time. The Bush Strike Group alone carried multiple guided missile destroyers and a fast combat support ship, keeping the entire formation fueled and supplied. So when Iran's fleet massed that morning, it wasn't sailing toward a handful of patrol boats. It was sailing directly into a waterway already occupied by 3 American carrier strike groups, backed by attack helicopters, guided missile destroyers, and unmanned strike drones, all armed, all in position, all already authorized to respond without waiting for new orders. 6 boats sunk before lunch wasn't a scramble. It was a fraction of one of the largest naval presences assembled in that region in over 2 decades, doing precisely what it had already been placed there to do. By the time analysts tallied the wider campaign months later, American forces had reportedly carried out more than 13,000 strikes against Iranian targets since the war began, damaging or destroying more than 155 Iranian vessels of every type. That scale of loss is exactly why Iran needed a fleet numbering, by some of its own estimates, well over 1,000 boats in the first place, just to have enough left in reserve to mass again by May. The road doesn't end there, though. On May the 6th, the American president paused Project Freedom, citing what he called great progress toward a possible full agreement with Iran. But a pause was never the same as an ending. The blockade stayed in place. The dispute over the strait stayed unresolved. Only the pace of the fighting changed, and Iranian state media told a very different chapter of this same stretch of road, describing their speedboat fleet as having turned the strait into a no-go zone for American forces, dismissing American claims of a crippled Iranian navy as hollow rhetoric that didn't match reality on the water. Iranian sources claimed the Revolutionary Guard could field anywhere from hundreds to potentially over 1,000 small attack boats, dispersed across hardened bunkers and remote island bases specifically so no single strike could wipe the fleet out in one blow. None of that is independently confirmed, and to be fair, some American claims describing Iran's navy as essentially destroyed weren't fully verified either. The honest picture likely sits somewhere between 2 governments, each telling the version that serves them best. Where would you land if you had to weigh both sides of that claim against each other? What is independently confirmed is that the road kept moving forward through summer. On July the 7th, the United States launched a new wave of retaliatory strikes after Iranian forces attacked 3 commercial tankers transiting the strait. That same week, Iranian state television broadcast footage of hundreds of thousands of mourners marching toward a mosque for the fallen supreme leader's funeral procession, some of them openly calling for revenge against American and Israeli leadership. In the days that followed, American forces struck dozens of targets: Iranian air defense systems, coastal radar sites, missile and drone capabilities, and more than 60 small Revolutionary Guard boats hit in and around the strait using fighter jets, naval vessels, and, for the first time in this conflict, unmanned attack drones operating on the water itself. That's a dramatically larger scale of small boat targeting than the handful destroyed back in early May, and it shows just how central the swarm strategy had become to the entire war by midsummer. Along this same road, other nations kept stepping in and out of the frame. The United Arab Emirates offered early on to join a US-led effort to help secure the strait, a meaningful gesture given how exposed its own shipping is to any disruption there. Iran, for its part, stood up its own authority, calling it the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, asserting the right to regulate or fully close transit on its own terms, separate from any international maritime framework. NATO stayed mostly in a diplomatic lane rather than a military one, with member nations reportedly preparing for a possible support role without committing forces directly. And in late April, after Iran briefly reopened the strait during a ceasefire extension and then shut it again in response to the American blockade, the president posted publicly that he had, in his words, all the time in the world, while Iran did not, arguing the standoff was draining Iran's economy at very little cost to the United States. Asked how long he'd wait for a deal, his answer was simply, "Don't rush me." Iran called the blockade an outright act of war and began seizing foreign commercial ships transiting the strait, accusing them of violating its own maritime rules, an almost mirror image of the exact tactic the United States was using against Iranian-flagged vessels from the opposite direction. Iran didn't absorb the July strikes quietly either. The Revolutionary Guard announced retaliatory attacks on facilities linked to the United States in Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Iran's self-declared Strait Authority insisted the waterway would stay closed until further notice, even as American command maintained commercial ships were still moving through. Around that same stretch, the president stated Iran had shot down a US Apache helicopter patrolling over the strait, and American forces reportedly carried out self-defense strikes on an Iranian ground control station in response. Iran then launched a fresh round of missiles and drones toward Kuwait and Bahrain. According to available assessments, every one of them missed its intended target. Which brings the road to right now, to this week, because this story genuinely has not finished. On August the 1st, the president announced he was cancelling a newly planned wave of strikes on Iran, saying Iranian officials and other regional governments had personally asked him to hold off, with reporting suggesting he'd specifically discussed the situation with Saudi Arabia's leadership, who raised concerns about the conflict spreading further. Military analysts have pointed out that both Saudi Arabia and Iran have strong economic reasons to want this to stop, given how exposed the whole region is to a continued closure of the strait. That window of calm didn't survive even a full day. By the 2nd and 3rd of August, the president was publicly calling Iranian leadership unbelievably duplicitous, after Tehran denied that direct talks with Washington had resumed, even as Iranian officials confirmed they were separately speaking with Oman about arranging a new route through the strait. The administration has continued describing a possible Phase 1 agreement narrowly focused on reopening the strait, with a far more complicated Phase 2 centered on Iran's nuclear program to follow later, both reportedly tracing back to an understanding the two countries signed back in June. Whether that understanding survives this latest round of public accusations is a question nobody on either side has answered yet. It's worth pausing here at the end of this road to really feel the size of what this crisis has cost, because the strait's importance isn't an abstract talking point on a briefing slide. Before the war began, roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade and about a fifth of global liquefied natural gas passed through the Strait of Hormuz. The moment Iran began restricting and at times effectively closing it back in February, oil and gas prices moved almost instantly on markets worldwide. Major oil-producing nations held an emergency meeting in early April and agreed to raise production quotas by roughly 200,000 barrels a day starting in May, specifically to cushion the world economy against the volatility coming out of this conflict. By July, the ripple effects had spread well beyond the Gulf, with some Asian oil buyers reportedly shifting toward alternative shipping routes entirely, proof that a crisis in one narrow channel of water can push pressure onto shipping lanes thousands of miles away. And underneath every number on every chart, there were real people. In mid-March, hundreds of ships, many of them flagged out of India, sat stranded near the strait rather than risk the crossing, even after Iran's own foreign ministry told American media the waterway wasn't technically closed to everyone, only to vessels linked to the United States and Israel. A strait that was technically open, but that almost nobody trusted enough to actually use. That's probably the truest way to describe how this crisis has functioned for global trade from beginning to end. Rarely a hard, total blockade. Almost always a climate of fear, expensive enough to change behavior everywhere, no matter what the official rules on paper said. Documented figures from the broader crisis point to at least one tugboat sunk, more than 17 merchant ships damaged, several abandoned outright by their own crews, 2 merchant ships captured, a dozen sailors killed or missing, and at least 1 port worker killed, with others wounded in a related incident in Bahrain. Somewhere in all of that is somebody's father, somebody's brother, an ordinary person doing an ordinary shift on an ordinary cargo run, who woke up one morning to find himself inside a war zone that used to be a shipping lane. So trace the whole road back, start to finish. It begins with a strike in February that killed a supreme leader and installed a harder government in his place within a week. It runs through a ceasefire in April that barely lasted a month, a blockade that intercepted more than 80 ships, a boarding operation on April the 19th, a named military campaign that sank Iranian boats within its opening days in May, a summer escalation in July that struck more than 60 small boats in a single wave, and a diplomatic process in early August that seems to be simultaneously close to a deal and one accusation away from falling apart completely. And at the center of that road sits the moment this entire story keeps circling back to. Roughly 130 Iranian fast boats caught in daylight by a commercial satellite, and behind them, waiting, already armed, already in position, 3 full American carrier strike groups, more than 200 aircraft, thousands of sailors and marines, guided missile destroyers, attack helicopters, and unmanned strike drones, every one of them already given the order to act without hesitation. Iran sent boats. America had already sent a fortress, and as of this week, nobody knows yet which version of the ending this becomes. A signed deal that reopens 21 miles of water for good, or another round of strikes and boats sent back beneath the waves. Somewhere out there right now, on the narrowest, most valuable stretch of ocean on the planet, both fleets are still watching each other across that gap, still waiting on a decision that isn't going to be made on the water at all, but in a room somewhere far from any coastline. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with longest, that the fate of a fifth of the world's oil and the lives of the sailors moving it comes down not to the boats or the carriers, but to whether 2 governments can find a way to stop testing each other before the next satellite catches something nobody can walk back.